Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me to speak at such a prestigious event, now in its 9th year, as we all know, and in such a fantastic location, and indeed in such an amazing venue. So what I'm going to talk about is a crucial issue that I think is entirely apt for an event that is all about new thinking, and an event that is all about what is coming forward, what is going to be hitting us, and what do businesses need to be thinking about. I think it's clear, no doubt, to all of us that the rules-based order is fracturing. The old rules no longer apply. In terms of hyperglobalization, that era has ended. So what do we need in terms of new thinking for politics, for the world, for the environment, for society? But crucially, with regards to business, I think the idea of the chief political officer is absolutely intrinsic. And it's intrinsic, and it needs to be placed particularly amongst bigger organizations at a C-suite level. Now, this might appear to be entirely obvious, but I think what we all know also is that business for years has effectively treated politics, geopolitics in particular, as, if you like, background noise, something that can be observed, read about, noted in the media, but then when the hard business of business gets going, it is almost ignored. The linkage between the two, I think, has always been fairly awkward. We know that politicians in particular, when they effectively meddle with business from a business leader's perspective, tend to do in an incredibly awkward way. A common complaint from businesses is that politicians don't understand the realities of business. And when politicians make the jump and often get involved from the point of view effectively of lobbying for acting on their behalf, then what do we see? Actually, the results are very often fairly chaotic. So then if the new rules mean that the old ones effectively really no longer apply, if we are effectively in a situation that can be described as the new abnormal, then I say what I think businesses need in particular is this idea of having someone at a senior level that clearly understands the political scene, the geopolitical scene, the geoeconomic scene. And what they're to do is to effectively act as a futures navigator, a sense maker, someone who can join the dots, act as an early warning device. Easy to say that perhaps with hindsight, when businesses could have been using this for years, but now I believe it's something we're seeing that is absolutely required. Hence, we're seeing this sort of thing being discussed everywhere from the FT to the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, etc., etc. This, I think, is aptly demonstrated by a number of reports, a classic one being this, the classic one being that the Global Risk Register, the Global Risk Index from the World Economic Forum, and put out again as per their last event in Davos. And what do we see there? I think a number of issues that effectively are cascading on businesses, that sum up the level of risk, that sum up the issues of uncertainty and the amount of uncertainty out there. Uncertainty obviously is nothing new. We go back to the Greeks, back to Heraclitus. No one steps in the same river twice. If we move forward through the years to the likes of Karl Popper, who said we always should be refreshing our thinking, bringing new thoughts into play in order to make ourselves apt and ready for the given moment. But if we just look at some of the issues laid out in the World Economic Forum's report, we can see how important they are, and saying crucially how interlinked they are. And this idea of having someone in the business, the chief political officer, or perhaps a director if it's a smaller organization, is, I say, absolutely vital. These are the sort of people that could have been warning businesses years ago about the interlinkage between issues like disinformation, misinformation. We know that the heart of and the foundation of any business, any brand, is trust. The heart of society is trust. We cannot operate unless we have trust between ourselves as individuals, as family members, on a business level, trust between client and supplier, trust between consumer or customer and business, be it either a B2C or B2B level, etc. And if we look at, say, some of the issues described, then we can see, so if it's either misinformation and disinformation, if it's issues about censorship and what is going on there, if we look at issues with regards to the erosion of human rights, the issues of intrastate violence, which we've seen exhibited, unfortunately, of course, only recently in the US. We can look to the issues of cyber espionage and cyber warfare, often being done on a state level, on a bagged actor, deliberate level. In the UK, our biggest car manufacturer, Jaguar Land Rover, as I'm sure you have all seen in the press, has been impacted by a massive cyber attack that's led to huge problems with the organization, losing, as they say to the media, up to £250 million a month, I'd say, and the rest. Perhaps if an organization like that didn't have any insurance against a cybersecurity attack, they would have been well placed, no doubt, hindsight being a wonderful thing, to have had someone in place that understood the types of risks, the level of the risks, and what was going on. We can look elsewhere, the issue of inequality, something that is impacting societies naturally around the world, that's impacting business leaders, that's impacting brand plans from the perspective of what is happening to their consumer base, what's happening to the customer base, what's happening in terms of if one has a broad brand portfolio. How does one deal with issues of inequality? Issues with regards to critical change to Earth systems, non-weather-related disasters, weather-related disasters. The issue, obviously, of the climate impact has been hitting businesses, has been hitting societies for years. It is quite extraordinary how in an organization, particularly larger organizations that frankly should know better, that no one really is charged with holding this knowledge. It's certainly not in marketing, it's not in operations, it's not in sales, it's not in finance, who are obviously all about risk. And so this idea of having someone who is charged with being able to understand the elements that are joining together, this understanding the cascading levels of risk is utterly, utterly vital. The decline in health and well-being, we know that well-being is by far the biggest sector there is, effectively, as it impacts and joins across on a horizontal and vertical level every other sector there is, and yet the understandings of it and how that impacts back on businesses is really genuinely understood. How one can actually deal with this, and the person, say, that has the understanding of these type of issues is very much linked with an area that's all about risk, that's all about uncertainty, and that naturally is foresight. Now, one could mention a whole plethora of people at this stage. I'll just focus on two. So from the point of view of the, and unfortunately I'm acquainted with both of these key thinkers, I've happily included the likes of Lord Massini, if one had the time. But in terms of, sort of living futurists, I'll say this, so Jim Data, gentleman on the left-hand side of the screen, of the many, many things that Data spoke about, and no doubt many of you will understand his thinking and know his thinking, but for those that don't, one of the things that he was, that is rightly lauded about was his 4 futures framework. The idea that any one of us, any business, any country, any organization can view it or their future through the prism of growth, constriction, collapse, or transformation is often a very simple jumping off point to laying out one scenario planning, to having a viewpoint on what's going on, and therefore afterwards to backcast, to understand the political linkages, the societal linkages, the economic linkages, and how they impact back on the business concerned. So when he would talk about growth, classically one would view that through the prism of effectively continued economic growth. Economists love, as we know, to extrapolate numbers. They'll effectively, generally speaking, take a look at the last few years' numbers and basically draw a straight line through them and say, effectively, that is where things are going. But as I say, at a time when we're seeing hyperglobalization ending, that perhaps is not the case anymore, when the old rules-based order is clearly fracturing. So the idea of just continued growth, perhaps we can put to one side for the moment, unless one is in the highly unusual situation of that being the case. If one is looking instead to the issues such as constriction, legislation, very often, for instance, sustainability linked, then one can look ahead, perhaps look around one and see where areas of legislation will be coming forward that could impact on the organization. Another area that data looked at was the idea of collapse. Dramatic though it may sound, but we have seen only over the last 12 months a number of high-profile collapses taking place. Now, often actually the data would look at this not in such a, perhaps a dystopian way, and one can often, when we're doing our scenario planning, our strategic forecasting, it's very easy, as I'm sure you're all aware, to look at this through the prism of dystopia. One can draw up a list very quickly of things that may be coming down the line, and those often do take a dystopian take. They're very often, or very rarely, should I say, utopian. But he looked at that really through the case of renewal. If one is faced with essentially a situation whereby one is reaching a dead end, or where things have to be genuinely transformed, rethought, reframed, relaunched, that is where one could look. And then, of course, obviously, he would look elsewhere at issues like, again, sort of transformation through the perspective of, effectively, innovation. And looking at that perhaps through the prism of who else, as a competitor, could we be seeing genuine transformation from? Which sectors can we understand ideas from? As the great financial writer Gillian Tett would put it from the Financial Times, we need to be looking across categories. We need to be looking across boundaries. We need to be looking further ahead in order to give ourselves the best chance of getting ahead and dealing with an era of incredible uncertainty and friction and conflict. Suhail Inayatullah, the other great futurist I'll mention briefly now, has brought to us an enormous amount of thinking, perhaps the easiest one that I'm sure you'll be entirely familiar with, but in case not, the futures triangle. If one ever has to put together a quick viewpoint for a C-suite meeting, for a strategy discussion or whatever, then the futures triangle, I believe, we can all agree, is a great way to do it. Certainly on MBA courses I've been teaching on for the last 25 years, it's a classic example of the sort of thing that we suggest that businesses use. So from the idea of everyone, every business, every organization, every state, for example, looking at things through the prism of, for instance, the weight of history. How did we get to where we are now? What is our cultural legacy? What are the causes of that? How does that impact on us now? And what our reputation may be in terms of reputation management, what we've actually brought with us, what we need to be concerned about, what we need to be aware of. The idea, and often we can look back and say, where was the strength of the organization? Have we perhaps forgotten about something that we need to realign with, particularly from the perspective of authenticity and trust and reliability and bringing that back to fruition? He would look at things like the push of the present. What are those issues around us, in particular, political issues, economic issues, societal issues that are impacting on the organization, be it on a governmental level, a private sector level, a public sector level, etc. What are those issues that are pushing us, that are impacting us, that we need to be aware of? And again, what are the interlinkages there? And who is it in the organization, or which department is it that is charged with genuinely understanding this and what we could do as a result? Not just from the point of view purely of reputation management, PR department, not just from the point of view of where we stand on a brand level level in marketing, perhaps, but on a genuine C-suite level, in terms of navigating our way through this, understanding, joining the dots, that is something that needs to be brought on board. And then the pull of the future. Where are things going? What is coming down the line? What is our scenario planning telling us to think about? What is our strategic forecasting suggesting we should be concerning? And yet, despite all this, we know about this from a wide range of studies over the years, classic ones being the EDHC Business School's viewpoint on organizations that utilize futures thinking, and found that very, very few do, and that few that do so profit in all senses of the word as a result. Recently, fantastic work put out by the Bavarian Futures Institute, the Bavarian Foresight Institute, looks at this and found out that, yeah, maybe claimed roughly 80% of organizations will claim they consider foresight at a sensible level. 1% of organizations do so on a 10-year plus level. So if one is looking at this on a horizon, on a 3-horizon level, as one naturally should always do, Horizon 1, what's going on now, Horizon 2, effectively what's coming through. One could look at sort of how can we exploit what's going on a classic innovation level, Horizon 3, genuinely new stuff, and what are the pockets of the future that we can understand and note that may point us a way forward. These are things that businesses should be considering, and yet, say, as the recent work from the Bavarian Institute point out, 1% do so on a 10-plus year level. One can look absolutely at the idea of megatrends, those big trends. They all say megatrends, the trends you can't get away from, structural trends that are linked to growth drivers. And depending which sector you're in, depending what sort of organization you're in, these will naturally be flagged up on a different level of importance in terms of who you are, what it is that you're up to, who it is that you're targeting, how it is that one could be impacting. If one is putting together chips as opposed to T-shirts, then perhaps one can say, yes, these things will be impacting the organization on a differing way. But the key thing that one is talking about now, as I mentioned earlier on, is this idea of linking them together, the idea that in a complex world, one needs someone to help steer us through this. If things are purely complicated, then perhaps we will say that complicated things link to rules, link to a rules-based order. It'd be so easy, one that says, to go back a few years when things seemed slightly calmer. In fact, very much calmer, very much more stable. That ain't the case right now. So again, the geopolitical officer is someone I would say that can help navigate one's way through this, join the dots, act as a forward-looking individual that understands what is going on. And then the issue, again, of, so how does this impact back on leaders? How should they link with all of this? I think here the issue of anticipatory leadership is absolutely key. So leaders that are putting in place organizations or an organizational ethos, framework, mood, culture that absolutely encourages transparency, that encourages collaboration and cooperation is absolutely the way to go. Again, so easy to say. People have been standing on stages talking about collaboration and cooperation since time began, effectively. How many organizations genuinely do this? I think one can answer that question by sort of on the fingers of one hand. So the idea, say, of anticipatory leaders that put in place a situation whereby they want to be as aware as possible of the outside world, of the external issues impacting back in on the organization are absolutely vital. And yet, on a C-suite level, really, who has that authority, if you like? Who is tasked with doing so? And these things seem to be just pushed around the organization to someone else. And naturally, the idea of national branding, the idea of the national brand and the national leader, and what the national leader may be saying or doing impacts right back, obviously, on a brand level, to the brand image itself, to the brand reputation. And one has to be very aware, again, on a political level of what is happening and how you can be using that information to impact back on the business, to help businesses, as I say, navigate a way forward. So to begin to finish off, that really is what I say this is all about, I believe. And this is certainly something that is being spoken about at business schools on an international level. There seems to be a strong agreement coming through that there's a hole in many, many organizations. And it is that political understanding, joining the dots, linking things together type hole that needs to be placed and understood with an individual, or indeed, of course, with a department if one has one. So to finish off, I think the call to action really is this, that we need to put into place anticipatory leadership. We need to elevate a geopolitical officer to the C-suite, because what they can do in terms of helping organizations not to fear the future, but to go towards a preferred future, is to help them do so, say, by navigating, by joining the dots, and by shining a light on the way forward. Thank you.